I'm Tania Castroverde Moskalenko, Chief Executive Officer of the Auditorium Theater at Roosevelt University. Thank you for joining us tonight for this special event that kicks off our 2017-2018 season and kicks off Roosevelt University's American Dream Reconsidered conference. The conference is devoted to examining the issues that are important in our country today, from healthcare to immigration. It is perhaps fitting that today, September 11th, such an important anniversary in our nation's history, we would be examining what the American dream means today. In honor of the lives that were lost on this day 16 years ago, I ask you to join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Auditorium Theater, the theater for the people, in our 17-18 season. And I want to take this opportunity to thank our season sponsor, the MacArthur Foundation, and our hotel sponsor, the Palmer House Hilton. In her book, My Own Words, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg says, "If I could choose the talent I would most like to have, it would be a glorious voice." Tonight, that's how I feel. She continues, "I would be a great diva, perhaps Renata Tebaldi, or Beverly Sills, or in the mezzo range, Marilyn Horne. Even though Justice Ginsburg is a sparrow, not a robin, as her grade school teacher once told her, today she appears on the same stage that has hosted countless great divas, from Adelina Patti in 1889 to Leontine Price to Beverly Sills herself. So I ask you that if she gets inspired this evening, that we all encourage her to give us a wonderful aria. Before we welcome the Justice to our stage, it is my honor to introduce to you the President of Roosevelt University, Dr. Ali Malekzadeh. Please help me welcome him.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Tania. I am very pleased to welcome you to the keynote conversation for Roosevelt University's second annual conference of the American Dream, Reconsidered. You will find a schedule for the conference in your program. We're grateful that you're here tonight. And we also thank the donors that have made our conference possible. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, Huntington Bank, and the Jack Miller Center. I also would like to give a very special thank you to Henry Fogel, Dean of the Chicago College of Performing Arts, who facilitated our introduction to Justice Ginsburg and set this evening in motion. Thank you, Henry. Also, Professor Lynn Weiner, Professor Stuart Warner, Michael Ford, and a team of faculty and staff worked all year to make sure this conference happens and tonight happens. Thank you so much, all of you. And let us not forget the staff for the Auditorium Theater, this magnificent theater for the people, for the job they do bringing us here tonight. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Roosevelt University was founded over 70 years ago when faculty, administrators, and students of the YMCA College of Chicago walked out to protest racial and religious admission quotas. We became one of the first universities in the country to admit all qualified students, regardless of age, race, religion, gender, social class, or nationality. This new college, created on the principle of social justice, was dedicated by Eleanor Roosevelt, and I quote, "to the enlightenment of the human spirit." The first classes, then as now, included students of all races, ethnicities, income brackets, and religions, veterans, immigrants, and refugees, students from big cities and small towns. In fact, one reporter in Chicago called it, and I quote, "Chicago's Equality Lab." What a legacy. Our mission has been to provide educational pathways to the American dream of opportunity, democracy, and justice. That is why this evening is so special to us. Having United States Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg here to talk about her life and her work provides an exemplary roadmap to our students as they begin to develop their own pathways to follow. Many of our students, staff, and faculty are immigrants. Raise your hands if you're immigrants. Or children of immigrants. Just like Justice Ginsburg, many are among the first in their families to go to college, like Justice Ginsburg. Many have faced discrimination, adversity, and challenges because of who they are, like Justice Ginsburg. So she's a model for all of us, someone who has not let prejudice or difficulty bar her way. Against all odds, she has succeeded in her goals and relentlessly pursued justice. And as you no doubt know, she has become the first Supreme Court justice to become a popular cultural icon. Sure, the notorious RBG. Justice Ginsburg exemplifies the American dream and the legacy and values of Roosevelt University. This evening, she will be speaking with Judge Anne Claire Williams, a United States Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. Now, Judge Williams also began serving in the federal judiciary in 1985, has been committed to creating opportunities for minority lawyers, and has also participated in numerous international judicial training initiatives. She also serves on the boards of the Carnegie Foundation, Federal Judges Association, and National Institute for Trial Advocacy. So welcome and thank you, Judge Williams. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and distinct pleasure to welcome to the stage Judge Anne Claire Williams and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. Please, it's enough. Okay, it's enough. Please be seated, everyone, be seated. I love you too.
Well, thank you, Tania and Dr. Ali, for the kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. I think you can do better than that. We have the rock star in the room. Good evening. And as Tania said, we remember those who died and suffered and lost their lives in 9/11. But we also send heartfelt prayers and blessings to all of our brothers and sisters dealing with the hurricanes across this country and in the Caribbean, the fires in California, the earthquake in Mexico. We want to remember them and think about them and send them our blessings and prayers. Right, Justice Ginsburg?
Yes, and it's a moment when we remember our fear, our anxiety, remember the horror of that day and the suffering that natural disasters cause. But there is a positive note, and that is Americans come together in a time of tragedy. I remember how the atmosphere was on 9/11. Everyone, the people who were victims were from many different national origins, race, religion, and yet we were together in our empathy for those people and their suffering. I just wish that spirit would last beyond the immediate tragedy.
That spirit of unity. Well, you can't imagine how thrilled we all were when Justice Ginsburg said yes. Yes to coming to Roosevelt University, yes to Chicago, yes to having a conversation about her remarkable life and career. She always says she's not a rock star, but we know she is. The second woman Supreme Court Justice, number 107 in the history of the country. And to understand how and why it is you are such a force, we begin at the beginning. Because you had loving parents, Celia and Nathan Bader, grew up in Brooklyn. Your family, as Ali said, your mom's side originally from Austria, your dad's people from Russia. You describe your growing up in a close, loving family. In fact, your mother's sister married your father's brother. And your parents didn't go to high school. What was their view of education, and how did they inspire you as you move forward?
My father didn't go to any school in the United States. He came here when he was 13 and went immediately to work. My mother did go to high school. She graduated at age 15. She went to work so she and her siblings could help support the eldest son in the family, the only one who had a college education.
And she inspired you, though, because you used to go to the library with her. And tell us what that Chinese food sign is about.
It was one of the great pleasures of my young life. My mother would deposit me in the children's section of the library, was one floor above a Chinese restaurant. And she would go to have her hair done and then come back. By then I would have picked out the 5 books to take home to read that week. But in my head there was this mixture of the delicious Chinese food being cooked and the books. And I see you have a Greek mythology, which I love Greek mythology.
And you also loved
Nancy Drew, yes.
And why did you love Nancy Drew?
Nancy Drew was a doer. and her boyfriend kind of trailed along. There weren't many books like that when I was growing up.
And you, inspired by your mother, were very active in high school. You wanted to be bat mitzvahed, right? And you were the first girl?
No, I was not, because that came much later. Bar mitzvah was for boys.
Right.
My dear colleague, Elena Kagan, was the first girl bat mitzvahed in her West Side of New York synagogue. Now, it was not possible for girls my age, which made us very jealous of the boys because they had a bar mitzvah and a big party and lots of presents.
But somehow you managed, without that bat mitzvah, to be a camp rabbi. Isn't that a picture of you when you were known as Kiki?
Yes, but the camp was all girls, so.
So that was pretty easy. And your mom continued to inspire you, but tragically your mom became ill during your high school years, is that right?
My first year in high school, yes. It was the beginning of her long bout with ovarian cancer.
You were very devoted to her and often studied at her bedside.
Yes. My mother wanted me to study hard and get good grades.
And you said at the time you were nominated to the Supreme Court that your mom was the bravest and strongest person that you had known who was taken from you much too soon.
Yes.
Her spirit, though, has carried you through, hasn't it?
Yes, I think my mother it would have been beyond her wildest dreams to see what has become of me. But she taught me a few important things, and one of them was to be independent. And by that she meant it would be nice if someday you found Prince Charming, but be prepared to fend for yourself. Have something that you can do to support yourself. And the other good advice was what she called being a lady, which meant don't succumb to emotions that do you no good. And on her list of those were anger, envy, and remorse. Her notion was those emotions will just sap your time, they won't get you anyplace, so forget about them.
And that's what you did, and you said that you prayed that you might be all that she would have been if she had been given an opportunity.
Yes, well, in those days, there were no anti-discrimination laws. So it was assumed that women would be paid less than men, that if they were working, they would be pin money earners and they wouldn't get any fringe benefits. That's the way the world once was.
You did so well that you did go to college. You chose Cornell. At that time, when you went, you were interested, Cornell, we have some graduates from Cornell. You were interested in teaching?
I can't really say I was interested. But it was considered a safe thing for girls. Mm-hmm. There were many women school teachers, and you could get a job and not face discrimination. But I tried it out. I went to Ithaca High School, and I was assistant to the history teacher, and there was a lesson I was to teach myself. The lesson it was about the Spanish-American War, and there was one list. It was the United States, everything the United States did was right, and everything the other side did was wrong. And I knew that that's not the way the world is, and I didn't want to teach children.
And so as you were trying to figure out what you would actually do, you actually met Marty, the love of your life.
When he was a second-year student, I was first-year student. I was 17, he was 18.
Blind date?
It was on my side.
So there's more to that story.
Yeah. Anyway, Marty and I, we were best friends for a long time because he had a girlfriend at Smith College and I had a boyfriend at Columbia Law School. Ithaca's, well, it's a long, cold week in between. But the truly amazing thing about Marty, he was the only boy I had ever known who cared that I had a brain.
And you eventually married Marty, and you were married for 56 years.
Yes.
Now, I think you got married at Marty's parents' home.
Yes.
And your mother-in-law had a special gift for you. We looked down at the bottom of the slide. Are those earplugs?
Yes, but they're not the right ones. The ones, well, let me tell you the story. So, I am about to be married, and my mother-in-law took me aside. We went into her bedroom. She said, "Ruth, I would like to tell you the secret of a happy marriage." Oh, it's something I'd like to know. And she said, "Dear, it helps sometimes to be a little deaf." And with that, she handed me a package of Max earplugs, which I use to this day.
And do you have them on sometimes when you're on the court?
But I am a little deaf when a colleague says an unkind word. You just tune out.
So that's the gift your mother-in-law gave you, the gift that keeps giving, right? And so you were married, and then Marty went to the military. He went to Harvard first and then the military?
He had 1 year of Harvard Law School and then was pulled out. It was the time of the Korean War. So the next 2 years we spent at Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
And you worked in the Social Security office, and that's where you first ran into, well, no, there have been issues in terms of being Jewish, but in terms of in the work life, discrimination.
I had taken an exam and I got a government rating of GS5. And I showed up at the Social Security office and told the head of the office, by the way, I'm 3 months pregnant. And his answer was, well, then you can't be a GS5. We will put you in at the lowest GS rating, GS2. And you'll do the work that we hired you to do, but you'll get the lowest possible rank. In those days, I didn't think there was anything to be done about it. That's the way it was.
Now, I'm going to fast forward a minute because you became pregnant with James, and there was something you did having learned this lesson, right?
And then when that was in 1965, yes, I had learned the lesson. So it was a wonderful thing that happened, that I became pregnant. But I had a year-to-year contract. I was teaching at Rutgers Law School. It's part of the state university. And I knew that if I told them about the pregnancy, my contract wouldn't be renewed. So this ever-helpful mother-in-law came to my rescue again. I wore her clothes for the last couple of months of the semester. And then with contract in hand, I said to my colleagues, when I come back in the fall, there'll be one more member of our family.
Now, Marty was discharged. He went back to Harvard. It was his second year, and you decided to go to law school. Tell us about that decision.
In fact, I decided to go to law school when I was at Cornell. When I realized that high school history teaching was not for me, I was turned on to the law because I saw what good it could do. My college years were not the best for the United States. It was the time when Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin was holding forth. Mm-hmm. He saw a communist in every corner. People were being hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Senate Investigating Committee, asked about some group that they belonged to in the 30s in the height of the Depression. And then I saw lawyers standing up for these people and reminding our Congress, there is a First Amendment that says we have the right to think, speak, and write as we believe, and not as Big Brother government tells us is the right way to think, speak, and believe. And also reminding the members of Congress when they were quizzing people, these people have Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. So my idea was I could be a lawyer and make a living that way, but I could also use whatever skill I developed to make things a little better, to help get us out of bad times.
And one of the dilemmas you faced was you had a daughter. You had a daughter, Jane. And what was the advice this time now from your father-in-law? What did he say to you?
I was accepted at law school and then took a leave for 2 years while Marty was in the military. And I worried, how will I make it at this place that legend has it is very rigorous, the Harvard Law School? And my father-in-law said to me, if you don't want to go to law school, no one will think the less of you. You will have a new baby and you will have the best reason in the world. But, he said, if you really want to become a lawyer, you will pick yourself up, you will stop feeling sorry for yourself, and you will find a way. And it was that advice that has stood me in good stead for my entire life. That is, I have to decide, do I really want this? And if the answer is yes, then you find a way.
And one of the third-year and Alondra Ibarra of Roosevelt, a philosophy, marketing, and political science student, wants to know, what's your advice for women who want to go to law school now?
I think there has not been a better time to be a woman and enter the legal profession, because no doors are closed anymore. I won't say there's no more discrimination. That would be an exaggeration. But think of the way it was for the 9 women in my entering law school class, a class of over 500. There would be sign-up sheets for interviews for jobs. They would say men only. There was no room in the dormitories for the women. They had to find a place in town on their own. But worst of all, I think this would be inconceivable to you in this audience, but classes were held in 2 buildings, and only one of them had a women's bathroom. Mm-hmm. So if you were stuck in the other building, it's bad enough to run out during a lecture, but if you're taking an exam, very time-pressured exam, and had to make a mad dash.
Sort of like the women in Hidden Figures.
Yes, mm-hmm. Very much like.
And you.
But well, I guess it was true for them too.
Right.
We didn't complain. We wanted to be there. We wanted to be law students. So we just accepted it. That's the way it was.
And you were really excited because the dean invited you, I think it was the dean, to come to his home for dinner.
He invited all of the women in the first-year class to have dinner at his home, and each of us was accompanied by a distinguished professor at the law school. The professors were distinguished, the dinner was not. But then after dinner, the dean seated us in a horseshoe in his living room and said, now I want each of you in turn to tell me what you're doing at this law school, occupying a seat that could be held by a man. So the dean years later explained to me that he didn't ask the question to wound or offend, but there was still, this is now 1956, doubting Thomases on the faculty who thought it was unwise to let women in. So he wanted to be armed with stories from the women themselves about what they would do with their Harvard Law School degree.
And though there were doubting Thomases, you were number 1 in your class at Harvard?
At Columbia.
And at Columbia, right?
Yeah.
And you were on the Harvard Law Review and the Columbia Law Review, which is the highest journal in the law school community? The most prestigious,
Yes.
I should say that.
Well, it was a good credential, especially when I went abroad, because it wasn't known that these are student publications. So,
So that was helpful. Now, one of the things that you said that helped you through law school was Jane. So that
Yes.
at 4 o'clock, what does that mean?
4 o'clock was when the nanny left. And we had a New England type nanny who came in at 8 in the morning. And then I went off to classes. I attended diligently, I studied hard, but 4 o'clock, my life changed from being a grindy law student to being a mom. So from 4 o'clock till when Jane went to sleep was Jane's time. So the heavy law books, and then an infant, not yet 2. So each part of my life was kind of a relief from the other. When I had enough of the books, there were silly games I could play with my daughter. We could go to the park. And when she went to sleep, finally, I was ready to go back to the law books.
And then in your second year, and I think Marty's third year, Marty got sick, and you had to organize his classes and the notes and things like that?
But he sick, really sick. He had a terrible form of cancer. And it was, we were very fortunate to be where we were. He had massive surgery, 3 surgeries, and he lived for many years after that. But managing his radiation, taking care of Jane, getting notes for his classes, keeping up with my own classes, the 2 of us figured that if we could survive that year, then there was nothing that life could throw our way. We couldn't manage.
And didn't Marty get better grades that year?
He got by far the best grades he ever got. Well, he went to school 2 weeks that spring semester at the very end, but he had the best teachers, his classmates. Harvard Law School is supposed to be a highly competitive place. All of his classmates, all of my classmates rallied around us. They were so wonderfully helpful, first visiting him in the hospital and then having individual tutorials to get him through.
It was truly a village that saved both of you that year. You then graduated. You worked for a law firm, I think the second year of law school. And that firm, when you graduated, they didn't give you a job. And there were 14 law firms you applied to, plus?
As many as would accept an application from a woman.
But didn't get one offer. You called it the closed door error.
Yes, I said I had 3 strikes against me. First being Jewish, which was becoming less of a problem. Law firms, large law firms, were beginning to accept Jewish associates. Then being a woman, and there were a couple of firms, not many, that would take a chance on a woman. But no firm would take a chance on the mother of a 4-year-old. Until my professor at Columbia Law School, Jerry Gunther, a world-renowned constitutional law scholar, he was in charge of getting clerkships for Columbia students. And he went to Edmund L. Palmieri, who was a graduate of Columbia College and Columbia Law School, and said, I'd like you to engage Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Palmieri said, how can I risk it? And Gunther said, you had a woman clerk before. Yes, I have, but she didn't have a child. So my professor made the judge an offer he couldn't refuse. He said, first, give her a chance, and if she doesn't work out, there's a young man in her class who will take over. He's got a job with a Wall Street firm, and he has promised me that he will pick up the clerkship if she fails. So that was the carrot. It was also a stick. And the stick was, if you don't give her a chance, I will never recommend another Columbia Law student to you. Now, I never knew any of this at the time. I just thought that this judge, who had 2 young daughters, was thinking about how he would like the world to be for his daughters.
Well, now things have changed because now 51% of law students are women. Women are 36% of lawyers. When we look at law firms, which didn't hire you, women are 45% of the associates, 21% partners, managing partners, and equity partners, but there's still a gap in the equity partner range, and the equity partner owns a share of the firm, and women are making 80% of the male salary. So still there are issues that we face as women in the law. Progress,
Yes.
but still challenges.
Yes. Open doors, but going up the ladder once you get through the door remains a problem. Justice O'Connor said something about that. She said, the more women who are out there doing things, the more opportunities will be open to women. And she said, we will all be better off for it. And do you know how she got her first job in the law? Justice O'Connor is a little older than I am, so she graduated, I think, in 51 or something like that. She was very high in her class at Stanford Law School. No one would hire her as a lawyer, as a secretary, yes, not as a lawyer. So what she did, she went to a county attorney in California and said, I will work for you free for 4 months. And at the end of that 4 months, you decide whether I'm worth putting on the payroll. And of course, she was the best person they ever had in that office, and she was on the payroll when 4 months ended. Well, and where you had, we're about a generation apart, so where you had your beginning, the U.S. Attorney's Office, was not possible for women of my generation. The U.S. Attorney's Office has a civil side that does civil cases, and criminal side does prosecutions. No women were accepted to be an assistant U.S. attorney on the criminal side. You ask why? Well, prosecutors have to deal with these tough criminal types. And my response was, have you been to the local legal aid office? Have you seen the people who are representing these tough criminal types? They're all women. But that was a job that paid very little.
So when you finished your clerkship, you then went to Sweden. And you had a project in Sweden that really opened your eyes.
I went to Sweden to write a book about their judicial system. I was an author for hire. It was not my idea. Columbia had a project on international procedure. So I went off to Sweden, and never in the winter, always in the spring and summer. And Sweden was quite ahead of us as far as recognizing what women can contribute. They had about 20% of the law students were women. One of the proceedings I watched in Stockholm, it was the judge, and there were 9 lay triers with her, sitting with her, and the judge was 8 months pregnant. The idea that families should have 2 earners, not only was it accepted, it was expected. Sweden at the time had a rather high rate of inflation, and if you wanted to support your family decently, you needed two incomes. But there was a woman named Eva Moberg. She wrote a column in the Swedish daily newspaper, and the gist of it was, why should the woman have 2 jobs and the man only 1? So she said, we are expected to have dinner on the table at 7, to buy the new shoes, take the children for their medical checkups, have his slippers ready for him when he comes home. And her tagline was, he should do more than take out the garbage. So that idea that a family should have 2 earners and 2 parents was brought home to me.
And so you ended up then going back to teaching, not high school, but you became a law professor. And you had been interested in procedure, but that experience in Sweden moved you in a different direction in terms of gender rights and women.
Yes, I put it on a back burner for a long time because it seemed to me there was no way, given the climate of our country at the time, the early 60s, there was no way to change things. But then there was the civil rights movement that provided grand inspiration. There was the revived women's movement all over the world. The UN had declared 1975 International Women's Year. The Equal Pay Act was passed in 63, and Title VII was passed in 64. Title VII is our principal anti-discrimination and employment law. So with those beginnings, the Equal Pay Act and Title VII, it was possible to move things in a new direction.
And you ended up producing the first women's rights law reporter and writing the first textbook on sex-based discrimination.
Yes, I was a faculty advisor to the women's law reporter. It was a student activity.
And one of the things that you noticed at Rutgers and Columbia was that law professors women received lower pay. And
not just law professors, all women in academia.
And you ended up suing?
Well, in Rutgers, there was a class action on behalf of all the women who worked on the Newark campus. It wasn't a Title VII, it wasn't an ambitious Title VII case. We weren't seeking promotion, just equal pay. And it was settled in 1969. The lowest annual increase that any woman got was $6,000, which in those days was real bucks. Then I moved to Columbia in 1972, and a feminist friend comes to my office to tell me, Ruth, Columbia has just fired 25 maids and not a single janitor. What are you going to do about it? Well, in the maintenance custodial department, there were 2 separate seniority lines. There were the maids and there were the janitors. And under the union contract, every janitor would have to go before, every woman would have to go before the first male was laid off. So I went to see the vice president for business at Columbia and told him Columbia is violating Title VII and you are going to lose this case. And he said, dear, we have very capable counsel. And wouldn't you like a cup of tea? Well, that Friday, so the maids were given notices on a Monday. Friday, every feminist in the area, it was Bella Absalom, Gloria Steinem, Susan Sontag, and it was a press conference, and we explained what was wrong about what Columbia did. There was an application for a temporary injunction to stop Columbia from going forward with these layoff notices. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission sent its chief counsel down to argue in support of the injunction. Then the union, whose contract Columbia was relying on, switched sides and came over. It finally dawned on them they have a group they can organize that they paid no attention to. So Columbia's lawyer said to the union lawyer, it's your contract. Well, we can't stand by a contract that violates Title VII. So Columbia was left all alone. This story has a happy ending. When Columbia was told you can't fire the maids, they somehow managed to deal with the oversupply in the maintenance department by attrition. So when the seniority lines had to be combined and the first few that would have to leave were men, Columbia found out, we really don't have to lay off anyone. So all the men stayed and all the women stayed. And two of the women in that process became shop stewards. These were women who said, frankly, we know we're being paid less and we don't care about that, but we want our job. We don't want to be on welfare.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, to me, this is a very important story because you were a relatively young lawyer and you thought beyond your just immediate needs, that is, being a law professor. You were thinking about those that had the least wherewithal or the ability, and you stood up, which is, of course, the story of her life, standing up. Now, in contrast to when you became tenured, there were less than 20 tenured women faculty, and now women are 25% of law faculty, 31% are deans, 35% of the overall faculty, and indeed, 2 of the last deans at Harvard have been women. And then your daughter, Jane, you were the first mother-daughter tenured women professors at Columbia, right?
Yeah.
So while you were teaching, you got involved with the ACLU and really focused on gender equality and co-founded the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And from Roosevelt University student Lauren Grimaldi, who's a political science major, she asked, what led you to help create it?
When we knew it was possible to turn the Supreme Court in a new direction. The Supreme Court, until the year 1971, had never seen a gender-based classification it didn't like. So it had held, when one very courageous woman in the 1870s said, we have this 14th Amendment. It says, nor shall any person be denied the equal protection of the laws. So she said, I am a person and a citizen. The most basic right of citizenship is the franchise. I want to vote. And the court's opinion denying her claim was to this effect. Yes, Virginia Minor, that was her name, we know you are a person and you're also a citizen. But so too are children. And who would suggest children should have the right to vote? Well, I'll skip over many cases until 1961. Is a woman named Gwendolyn Hoyt from Hillsborough County, Florida. She was what we would today call a battered woman. And one day, her philandering husband had humiliated her to the breaking point. She saw her young son's baseball bat in the corner of the room, grabbed it, brought it down with all her might on her husband's head. He fell against the stone floor. End of her humiliation, end of their fight, beginning of the murder prosecution. Gwendolyn Hoyt had this idea. If there were women on my jury, they might better sense the rage I was feeling. And not that they'd necessarily acquit me, but they might convict me of the lesser crime of manslaughter rather than murder. But she faced an all-male jury because Florida didn't put women on the jury rolls. When her case was thought to be the very liberal Warren Court in 1961, the court's opinion was to this effect: we don't know what Gwendolyn Hoyt is complaining about. Women have the best of both worlds. True, they're not on the jury rolls, but if they want to serve, they can go to the clerk's office and sign up. Well, how many people would sign up for jury duty if they could escape it? And they said it's perfectly reasonable for the women to be left off the jury roll because, after all, they are the center of home and family life. That was it. And you can imagine Gwendolyn Hoyt in prison reading this. And she said, well, what about me? Anyway, that's the way it was until 1961. But in 1971, the Supreme Court changed. And why? People say, what's going on in society, does it affect the court? A very astute law professor said, courts should never be affected by the weather of the day, but inevitably they will be affected by the climate of the era. And the climate of the era was right for the assertion of equal rights and opportunities.
And so you argued 6 cases, you won 5 of them, and your philosophy was take it step by step. And that first one was the Reed case, which held that women have the right to serve an administrator of an estate. The second, Frontero, military housing benefits to husbands equals wives. The third one, property tax exemption not equal for surviving husbands and wives. You didn't win that immediately, but the next one, Weinberger, child care survivor benefits for the husband equals wives. Califano, Social Security benefits, survivor benefits for men equals women. And then 79, women have the right to serve on a jury. And then eventually in 88, Florida amended the statute to extend tax exemption to widowers. So when we look at these cases, several of the plaintiffs in the cases were men. Why did you adopt that strategy?
Well, let's take Weisenfeld. This is a young man whose wife died in childbirth. She had been a school teacher, a math teacher. She had a very healthy pregnancy. She was in the classroom into the 9th month. And then when Stephen Weisenfeld took her to the hospital to give birth, the doctor came out and said, Stephen, you have a healthy baby boy, but your wife died of an embolism. So Stephen vowed that he would not work full-time until his infant son was in school full-time. He figured that between part-time earnings and the Social Security benefits, he could just about make it. So he went to the local Social Security office, and he was told, "We're sorry, but these are mother's benefits. They're available to widows, not widowers." Now, his case was a perfect example of what's wrong with gender lines in the law. Where did the discrimination begin? Well, it began with Paula Weisenfeld, the woman who worked and paid the same Social Security taxes that men pay, but her Social Security taxes didn't get for her family the same protection. Stephen was obviously discriminated against as a parent because he would not have the option to take personal care of his child. He would have to work full-time to make the income the family unit needed. And then my later chief, then Justice Rehnquist, said, "I get it. This is rank discrimination, and it discriminates against the baby because the baby, if the baby's father died, the baby will have the opportunity for the mother's care. But if the baby's mother died, will not have the opportunity to have the personal care of a parent. That makes no sense." So Weisenfeld's an example of how these gender lines hurt everybody. They hurt the woman, they hurt the man, and the baby, who, by the way, grew up to be a lawyer and then an investment banker, and now has 3 children of his own.
All right. Now, just one other question before we then begin the story of your judicial career. That first case you argued in 1971, the Reed case.
There was Frontiero was the first one I argued. I wrote the brief in Reed.
You wrote the brief in Reed, you argued in Frontiero. How did you feel when you had to make that argument before the Supreme Court?
Frontiero was an afternoon case. The court heard 2 cases in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. I was up at bat in the afternoon. I did not dare eat lunch, fearful that I couldn't keep it down. I was extremely nervous. But I had a well-planned, memorized first sentence that I knew I could get out. And then I looked up at the bench and thought to myself, these are the most important judges in the United States. And I have a captive audience. They have to listen to me. They have no place to go. And then suddenly I felt, instead of being nervous, a great sense of power, authority. For one thing, I knew a lot more about the subject of gender-based discrimination than any of the justices did. So I wasn't, in the end, I was a school teacher.
Right.
Because I figured that the understanding of the judges in the early 70s, the understanding of discrimination on the basis of gender, it was about at the kindergarten level. And my job was to take them up at least to high school.
All right. So then you discovered you liked kindergarten over high school.
But you had to do that not by being angry, not by saying, "You sexist pig." You have to do it through sweet reason. You have to make them want to decide in your favor.
And to take it step by step and to lay it out for them, like for kindergartners, like you said. So now, then...
Which, by the way, I have to say, that technique, step by step, comes from Thurgood Marshall, who many times said, he was arguing against enforced separation of the races in school. He would tell the court, "Separate but equal is not before the House today. These facilities are vastly unequal." And when he had all the building blocks in place, when he had the case of the Texas, he set up a separate law school, separate and vastly inferior, and college cases, when he had those building blocks in place, then he said to the court, and now I'm asking you to recognize that forced separation can never be equal. And so that's what we did too. We tried to take clear winners, like Sally Reed's case. Sally Reed was another tragic case. She was married, had a son. She and her husband separated, and she had custody of the son when he was, quote, of tender years, when he was a little boy. Father applies for custody when the boy reaches his teens, saying now he needs to be prepared for a man's world. Sally thought that was a terrible mistake. And sadly, she proved right, because when the boy was in his father's custody, he became extremely depressed, and one day took out one of his father's many guns and killed himself. So Sally wanted to be appointed administrator of his estate, not for economic reasons. There was nothing there. There was a small bank account, a record collection, a guitar, some clothes, that's about it. But for sentimental values, he was her son. The probate court judge told Sally Reed, I have no say in this matter because the Idaho code tells me what I must do. And the code reads, as between persons equally entitled to administer a decedent's estate, males must be preferred to females. It's just that simple. And it was something remarkable about Sally Reed and our legal system. Sally Reed was a woman from Boise, Idaho. She made her living by taking care of elderly and sick people in her home. I doubt that she even had heard the word feminist, but she thought that an injustice had been done to her and that the legal system could make it right. So she took her case on her own dime to 3 levels of the Idaho Supreme Court, and it turned out to be the turning point case in the Supreme Court.
And with all the work you did in this area, you certainly came to the attention of President Jimmy Carter, and you were appointed to what is called the second most powerful court in the country, although I'm from the 7th Circuit. And you were appointed to that court, and since 1789, when the federal judiciary began, there had only been 12 women until you on the Court of Appeals. And Florence Allen was appointed in 1934, Shirley Hofstadler in 68, but it was a sea change with President Carter.
Yes.
Tell us about
and
that.
It was, in his own words, Jimmy Carter was determined to change the complexion of the federal judiciary. He looked at who were the federal judges. He noticed a certain resemblance. They all looked like him. They were all white and they were all male. So he said, that's not how the great United States is. We are people of diverse races, religions, women as well as men. So he determined to appoint members of minority groups and women to the bench in numbers, not like Florence Allen and Shirley Hofstadler, one at a time, curiosities. And he said he had a reception in the fall of 1980 when I think he knew he would not win the election. But he said, even though he never had a Supreme Court appointment to fill, he hoped he'd be remembered for changing the face of the U.S. judiciary. So when people When I'm asked, did you always want to be a judge? My goodness, what I wanted was a job in the law. Women weren't judges. It was an impossible dream until Jimmy Carter made it his mission to change that.
And in terms of the federal judiciary, and the state court judiciary, we actually have two systems. The federal chart is on one side, which shows that federal judges are appointed for lifetime, recommended by senators, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and you start at the district court level and make your way up to the Supreme Court. On the state court side, there are usually term limits for judges. Those judges are elected by citizens, appointed by the governor, and just an idea to give us a sense of how many cases, you can see how many cases are just in the Illinois system itself. So the federal courts hear way fewer cases than in the state courts. And one of the things I wanted to note, it says the Supreme Court hears roughly 75 cases, but there are between 7,000 and 8,000 cert petitions filed. So how do you decide what cases to hear? How do you get to that 75 or 80?
Long ago, the Supreme Court decided it could not function as what lawyers called an error correction instance. That is, it didn't sit simply to right wrong judgments. There is the federal district courts, and on top of that, the courts of appeals. They do a fine job with the everyday administration of justice. So the Supreme Court decided that its function was to step in when other courts disagree on what the federal law is, whether it's the meaning of a federal law or of a constitutional provision. You can't have one law, one federal law in California, another one in Illinois. So we tend to take cases only when other courts have disagreed on what the federal law is. So the first case that we're going to hear in this term, it comes from your circuit. It's about the Federal Arbitration Act and the National Labor Relations Act, two provisions of these statutes that clash. So your circuit and Ninth Circuit came out one way, the Second Circuit and the Fifth the other way. That's when we step in to keep the law of the United States more or less uniform.
And then with President Carter, we can see from this chart, from 1789 in terms of the federal judiciary to now, there have been 409 women, 11%. On the state courts, we've had 5,600 women out of 18,000 positions, 31%. And historically on our trial courts, 12%, currently 26% in the district court, 12% on the circuit, 27% 2017, and now 4 women on our Supreme Court, and now 3.
Well, I wish it were 4, not yet. Oh, you're in Illinois.
Right.
In Illinois,
right.
So you're ahead of us.
Right. We are. And so, in terms of women in progress on the court, we've spoken about Jimmy Carter, but what about this issue of unconscious bias in women?
Yes. It is one of the lingering problems. And my illustration of unconscious bias, I've referred to it many times, is the symphony orchestra. Growing up, I never saw a woman in a symphony orchestra, except perhaps the woman playing the harp. People who were in the music business swore that they could tell the difference between a woman playing the piano or the violin and a man. A well-known critic from the New York Times, Howard Taubman, said, "Blindfold me, and I'll tell you if it's a woman at that piano." Someone took him up on it, and they did, and he was all mixed up. The one he thought was a woman was a man. And so then they came up with the brilliant idea, why don't we drop a curtain between the people who are applying for positions in the orchestra and the people who are conducting the audition. And let's see what happens. Well, it was almost an overnight change. With that simple device, the unconscious bias was taken out of the picture. A very fine violinist, well known in this town, Jennifer Coe, when I was telling the story, she said, "You left something out." Okay, Jennifer, what did I leave out? You left out that we auditioned shoeless, so they won't hear a woman's heels coming on the stage.
And as you said, people certainly know that women are present on the court. We're all over the bench, and we're certainly here to stay. So then we move to your appointment to the Supreme Court. The vote in the Senate was 96-3. It took 50 days. Compared to today, what's that nomination process like? Is it broken?
Let's go back to the 80s. First, when my dear colleague, who I miss very much, Justice Scalia, he was, I think it was 86, he had a track record. He was a well-known conservative. The vote in support of his confirmation was 100%, not a single negative vote. 1993, only 3 negative votes for me. Same for Justice Breyer. He had a number in the 90s. Well then, with the Chief and Justice Alito, worse with Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan, the bipartisan spirit that had prevailed in the 80s and the 90s failed, and people voted along party lines. Now, if you were just judging it on the basis of merit, our Chief Justice, John Roberts, should not have had any negative votes. He had many on the Democratic side. Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, superbly qualified jurists, had many negative votes on the Republican side. People voting along party lines. That's a very dangerous thing for a judiciary. It's supposed to judge impartially, without respect to persons. So my hope, and I hope I will see this in my lifetime, is that our Congress will get over this nonsense and go back to the way it was when it was functioning.
And I can see you all love this photo as much as I do, with all the women justices. And so I want to ask you, Justice Ginsburg, is 4 enough, or 3 that are serving now?
And you know I haven't asked that question, and you know my answer is
Yes.
always, there'll be enough when there are 9 women. Well, most of the time, my answer does not elicit this enthusiastic response. But then I say, why would you think it's strange to have 9 women when for most of our country's history, it's been 9 men?
All right. Now, you mentioned Justice O'Connor and the influence she had on you. She was your big sister, but initially when you were together, people would confuse you during oral argument. And so, is it true that there were t-shirts made so that people could keep you straight?
Justice O'Connor, the first woman ever appointed to the Supreme Court, was all alone on that bench for 12 years. So the lawyers who appeared before the court it finally sunk in, yes, there is a woman on that court, and her name is Sandra Day O'Connor. Then I get added, and invariably, one counsel or another, when I ask a question, will say, Justice O'Connor. And Sandra would sometimes intervene and say, I'm Justice O'Connor, she's Justice Ginsburg. But the idea was, there's a woman on the court. So when we hear a woman's voice, it's got to be Justice O'Connor. Never mind that we don't look a bit alike. And I'll tell you a story about stereotypes. So there was a woman, a linguist, who was, she felt, she was unhappy because one day there was a headline in USA Today. The headline was, Rude Ruth Interrupts Sandra. What did that mean? Well, Sandra she was usually, when she was with us, she usually asked the first question. And I tried not to step on her questions, but I didn't know she had a follow-up. So when I intervened, she said, I'm not finished. I apologized to her after. She said, Ruth, the guys do it to each other all the time. And the interesting thing is the reporter who labeled me Rude Ruth, I suggested that he watch the men. And he said at the end of the month, you know, she's right. The men do interrupt each other all the time, but I never noticed it until it was two women. Anyway, the T-shirt story is the National Association of Women Judges knew there would be this confusion. So they gave us T-shirts, and hers read, I'm Sandra, not Ruth. Mine, I'm Ruth, not Sandra. You know, if you think about the court as it was then, Breyer and Souter looked much more alike.
One of the cases that you were most proud of on the court was the 1986 Virginia Military Institute case, and it was a vote of 8-1. And you actually ended up coming there some years later, and one of the male cadets gave you his pin. And you mentioned that having women on the court, that a difference can be in our backgrounds. Why is that important to have women on the court, and what effect does it have?
Let's just point out that picture was taken in February of this year of the women cadets at VMI. They are now more than welcome. These bright young women, they're going to be engineers, nuclear scientists. They're living under the same Spartan conditions as men, but the school did make one compromise. That the first year things were rocky. They said no dispensation for the women. So they will have to have their head shaves when they come in, just like the men. And then it dawned on them, it really wasn't necessary to make everything exactly the same. The women live in the same Spartan quarters, and they're subject to the same rat line. But as you can see, they can wear their hair the way they like.
And in the last 30 years, there have been many chief justices. But what usually comes to the public's attention most are those decisions that are 5-4, that 20%. That 20% that covers the topics that we have listed on the side. So how is it that you can work together with, say, and we know Scalia was one of your dearest friends on the court. had very different views than you had. How is it that you're able to work together? That's one of the questions Dylan Warren, who's a marketing political science student here, and Randy Colin want to know. How difficult is it to reach common ground, and how is it you can move together even though your views are diametrically opposed?
And I suppose the principal reason is that we revere the institution for which we work, the Supreme Court of the United States. And you are a member of a collegial court, you know it. It just won't work if you didn't genuinely respect your colleagues and like most of them. So Scalia was one of the reasons he was such a favorite of mine, is he was a very funny man. And when he was my buddy on the DC circuit, there were only 3 judges on a panel. He's sitting next to me and he'll say something that will absolutely crack me up. And I have to pinch myself very hard so I won't look less than sober as a judge.
And one of the things you said was that sometimes when you exchange your drafts with him, he might have helpful suggestions to make your dissent stronger, or you might have helpful suggestions for him.
Well, my suggestions for him are only one way. You'd be more persuasive if you tone this down. You don't make it quite so jazzy. For me, Scalia did one thing quietly. He was a great grammarian. His father was a professor of Latin at Brooklyn College. His mother was a grade school teacher. So he was a very good grammarian. And if I made a grammatical slip, he would either call me or come into my chambers. He didn't advertise it to the rest of the court. But he didn't help me to strengthen my opinion when I was in the majority. But he, in a very important way, he did. And he didn't come and offer suggestions about change this sentence or make this point. He did it by writing a dissenting opinion that was a zinger, a dissenting opinion that pointed out all the soft spots in my opinion. And that gave me an opportunity to rewrite those portions, to strengthen them, to make them more persuasive than they were to start out with. So I loved it when Scalia was on the other side, because it meant I was going to end up with an opinion that took care of all the soft spots and that was going to be powerfully persuasive.
In one of the cases that was really controversial, Bush versus Gore, that he just told you to take a hot bath.
Yeah.
Well, and as you said, the court is a reactive institution, never in the forefront of social change. There's always movement in society pushing the court that way.
Yes.
So, for example, gay rights is something you had anticipated. There's a reason that you said it seems like progress was made very quickly in these last 5 years or so.
It was because people came out of what we said was the closet. People fearful to admit that they were gay, fearful that they'd lose a job. But it's only when gay people decided, this is what I am and I'm proud of it and it's okay. I'm not going to hide in any closet. I'm going to come out front and make that affirmative statement. And also acting it's not, you weren't alone. There were so many like you and so many people who supported people like you. So it's only when it became a visible movement that the court was going to do anything about it.
And of course, people found out their best friends, their brothers, their nieces, their nephews.
Yeah. I said it didn't have, as some racial controversies did, the kind of we, they. we are this and they are that. So who were they? They were our child's best friend, maybe our child, our next door neighbor, people for whom we had respect, affection. So that hastened the change as well.
And then there was this case, the Lilly Ledbetter case, where the majority said the equal pay lawsuit has to be filed within 180 days of the initial action, not the recent paycheck, and you dissented in that case. And you've said, I am dejected, but only momentarily. These important issues, they're going to come back again and again. There'll be another time, another day. And one of the things that you do when you're dissenting is you wear a dissenting collar.
Yes. But in Lilly Ledbetter's case, I said also, the tagline of my opinion was, the ball is now in Congress's court to correct the error into which my colleagues have fallen. And in that photograph is President Obama signing the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which does adopt the paycheck rule.
So sometimes it's the court that makes the correction, or it's Congress that can make the correction.
If it's an ordinary law, Congress can do it. If the court is parsimonious in the way it reads Title VII, Congress can fix that, as it has done more than once.
So in your chambers, you have quite a few parties for the birthdays of clerks, for your birthdays. One of the things the clerks can do when it's your birthday is ask you questions, right? About your life or whatever they want to ask. You've had more than 80 clerks, right?
I figured out 3 a year, 13 years on the DC Circuit, 4 a year on the Supreme Court, is a lot.
And one of the things we look back when you couldn't get that job in the law firm, you've said so often in life, things that are impediments turn out to be great good fortune. Had you got that job in the law firm, you might not be a justice today.
Yes, and it's the same reaction that Justice O'Connor had. So she said, suppose we had come of age at a time when there was no discrimination, where would we be today? We would both be retired partners from some large law firm. So you never know in life. Things, when something looks bleak, it may turn out to be to operate in your favor.
Now, we've talked about Marty and how critical he was and sort of the balance. And Marty was actually the chef in your family. He was a brilliant tax attorney and a professor. You've said he was your biggest cheerleader. You had equal parenting responsibilities. And then when he passed, his recipes were made into a book. And is it the bestseller at the Supreme Court gift shop?
The Supreme Court spouses decided that the best tribute they could arrange for Marty, because he was a truly great cook, was this cookbook. So he had about 150 recipes on a disc. They selected about 30. Each section is introduced by a spouse, so Maureen Scalia leads off. The project was, it was inspired by Martha Analito, who also loves food. And then my daughter saw the selection that Martha Analito had made, and she said, "Mother, Daddy would not have picked those recipes." So I said, "Okay, Jane, you pick the ones that you think should be in Chef Supreme." So every one of those recipes, it's in the book, some 30-odd, Jane picked, including one that's called Jane's Caesar salad. So she snuck one of her own recipes.
And speaking of Jane, when she was growing up, you took your hand at cooking and you used the 60-minute chef.
Yes.
And you knew how to prepare 7 meals?
We rotated, yes. The first rule was no more than 1 hour from when I walk in the door till when dinner is on the table. We had a freezer, so I could have a supply of my 7 things that I made. And we got up to number 7, we went back to number 1. Well, my food-loving daughter realized that there was an enormous difference between Daddy's cooking and Mommy. And therefore, Mommy should be phased out of the kitchen altogether. Daddy should become the everyday cook in addition to the weekend and company cook.
That's right. And in fact, Jane is a foodie and loves to cook. And since Marty passed, Jane, still being a law professor, Jane comes in once a month to fix meals for you that she freezes,
yes,
so that you'll always be able to have dinner. And before we move to our final set of slides, one of the things that you've said is that as you balance things, you can't have it all at once. What do you mean by that?
This was in response to an article to the effect that women can't have it all. Well, my first response to that, well, who has it all the time, every day? I can look across my long life and say, yes, I have had it all, but not necessarily at the same time. So in any marriage, you can make accommodations one to the other. When Marty was at a law firm, determined to become a partner in record speed, so I took on most of the child care and household responsibilities. Then, when the women's movement came alive and Marty realized how important this was, and then he did the lion's share of the work. But you adjust to each other, and as I said, over the long haul, I have had it all.
Now you have hobbies. We know you love opera. There's an opera named after you in Scalia, and there you are in costume.
Well, not for our opera. Can I tell them a little bit about Scalia Ginsburg, how it goes?
Okay.
Because it's supposed to illustrate. There's two people think very differently on matters of interpretation of texts, but who are genuinely fond of each other. Anyway, Scalia comes out first. He has, it's called a rage aria, for those who know music. It's very Handelian in style. And he sings, "The justices are blind. How can they possibly spout this? The Constitution says absolutely nothing about this." And then I tell him in my lyric soprano that he's searching for bright line solutions to problems that don't have easy answers. But the great thing about our Constitution is that, like our society, it can evolve. And so that sets up the
opera. So one of the other things, one of your hobbies is working out. You have a trainer, Brian Johnson. You train with
Yes.
him twice a week. You do 30-second planks. And there you are working out with Brian. And he calls her Tan because she's tough as nails, and the book is coming out next year. Your RBG workout, right?
It's Brian's book. Brian,
Right.
He was approached by a number of publishers to say, give us the lowdown. What is Ginsberg workout routine? So this book tells it all.
And it was actually Marty that got you to work out because it was your either first or second bout of cancer, and he said you look like you had come from a concentration camp. And so you've been working out since 1999.
Right.
And you actually left the White House dinner to come and work out with Brian. And then we got to wrap up here. I just call this the making of notorious RBG. It had to do with the Shelby County case where the Justice Department made changes to state voting procedures and also Hobby Lobby, and those two young women did a Tumblr on you. And at the time, you didn't even know who Notorious B.I.G. was, did you?
Well, first I should say these women are an illustration of what I mean by anger being a useless emotion. So they're angry about the Supreme Court cutting the heart out of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County case. And then they decide that won't get us anyplace. Let's do something positive. They put my dissent on the internet, and then it took off.
And then you discovered you had something in common with...
Oh, with Notorious B.I.G., yes. Well, it's obvious. We were both born and bred in Brooklyn, New York. Thank you.
And so, as a consequence, every and all things are RBG. Just a sample, I love you as the princess. Then little girls, RBG, and my personal favorite, the dog, wearing your RBG t-shirt. There have been books on you. There were books before, but now there are more books. There are coloring books. There are magazine articles and more serious books. Then you decided to write in my own words, or not, you didn't write it, but you agreed, and you dedicated to Marty, your dear partner and constant uplifter. And as your assistant says, there's something new and exciting every day working in your chambers. And coming up is a biop of you on the basis of sex that Felicity Jones is starring in. So how do you deal with all of this? And as we see, you're a role model for young girls. Women belong in places, all the places where decisions are made, and women shouldn't be an exception. And so this little girl looks like a justice in every respect. So, you know, I met you when you sent a letter to me in 2001. I was president of the Federal Judges Association, and I had just introduced President Bush. And I had this letter that you sent to me, which I saved forever because you were my role model. And I thought I was special until I realized that's what you do with everyone. You have teas for women. You support your law clerks. Why is that so important that you've become a role model?
And why are you my favorite conversation partner? You know, when I was asked to speak here this evening, I said there's only one person that I would like to have as a conversation partner, and that's the Honorable Anne Claire Williams.
So some of these life lessons we've covered, and I'm getting the signal that we're over time. I guess if you could just pick maybe one of those that we haven't talked about.
One that you have up on?
Right, because I think there's pretty clear this is your advice on life lessons, and you've covered some of those. Is there anything in particular you'd like to talk about?
Maybe this combines the two on the left bottom. That is, I think everyone who is in the legal profession has an opportunity and responsibility to use her skill or his skill to make life a little better for people who are not so fortunate. And that's my idea of what it means to be a true professional, that you're not just working to turn over a buck, but that you are devoting part of your time to making things a little better for less fortunate people, to help repair tears in the community where you live.
And certainly we need that now, because there are a lot of tears in our community, right? So Justice Ginsburg, how do you want to be remembered?
Oh, as someone who tried her best with whatever talent God gave her to move things in a better direction, to make this a place where people can live safely, without fear, and with confidence that if they're willing to put in the hard work that it takes, that dreams can come true.
And finally, how long will you serve on the court?
The opera Scalia Ginsberg ends with Scalia's death, and then I remain on the stage, silent for a moment, and then I say, "There's work to be done. I will remain to do it as long as I can, full steam." Thank you.
You said at the beginning that you prayed you would be all that your mother would have been if she had lived in an age when women could aspire and achieve and were cherished as much as sons. I think we all agree you have been more than what your mother could have dreamed or imagined, a transformational, phenomenal woman and inspiration to all. That's who you are, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Thank you.